Pull over, now. The officer's voice was sharp, impatient, and dripping with authority. Not the calm voice of reason, not the voice of safety. The elderly Deacon, 68, had driven down this very stretch of Main Street hundreds of times. Sunday mornings, choir rehearsals, youth group meetings, a life devoted to service, to faith, to his community. And yet tonight, it felt like every mile he'd ever walked in his neighborhood had led him to this one humiliating moment. Harold exhaled, slowly. "Yes, officer," he said, his voice steady but tinged with fear. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, catching the hard lines of the man behind the badge. Young, impatient, too eager to assert control over someone his own grandfather's age. As he eased the car onto the shoulder, Harold's mind raced. Was it the broken taillight? Or had he, somehow in that split second, looked suspicious simply for being black, driving his own car in his own neighborhood? The officer approached, boots clanging against the asphalt, his stance aggressive, chest forward, hands on his duty belt. "License and registration, now," the officer barked. Harold reached carefully into his wallet, hands shaking slightly, but not from guilt, fear, indignation, humiliation. "Sir," the officer continued, leaning closer, "do you know why I stopped you?" Harold shook his head slowly. "No, officer." "You were weaving, almost hit the curb back there. You could have—" Harold opened his mouth, ready to protest, but the words died in his throat as the officer's glare pinned him to his seat. The words weren't just criticism, they were accusation, judgment, and a kind of venom reserved for those society already suspects before a single fact is known. "Step out of the car," the officer ordered. Harold's heart pounded, his breath caught. Step out? For what? A minor driving error? A tail light? Or had the mere color of his skin and the crease in his forehead marked him guilty in the officer's eyes? He opened the door, hands raised slightly. Hands where I can see them. A crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, eyes peeking from darkened porches, neighbors whispering to each other in the distance. Some recognized Harold. They knew his church, his decades of service. Some didn't care. To them, it was just another black man stopped by police, another tense moment in a country that had grown too comfortable with fear over facts. The officer leaned close. "I could arrest you right now, resisting, reckless driving. Who knows what else I'll find?" Harold's breath caught in his throat. The weight of the past, every story he'd heard, every warning from friends and family crashed down on him. And yet, he remembered his father, his mother, his pastor's voice on Sunday mornings. "Stand firm, Harold. Speak truth. God sees everything." The officer's hand hovered over the car, impatient, ready to escalate. Harold's eyes flicked toward the glove box. He had nothing illegal, nothing to hide, but there was one thing in there, something that would turn this moment upside down, something he hadn't planned to use as a shield, but now could be the difference between fear and survival, humiliation and truth. The officer leaned even closer. "Do you know how long I've been watching this street? You think you can just drive like you own the place?" Harold's pulse hammered in his ears. He could feel the weight of every stereotype, every assumption pressing down on him. The world had learned to judge him long before this officer's eyes met his. And now it felt like the culmination of a lifetime of whispered suspicion. But he remembered the youth at his church, boys who trusted him to teach them courage, integrity, faith. He remembered the Sunday mornings when he preached hope to the elderly, the widows, the lost. He remembered the quiet dignity of his mother, always insisting that honesty and calm could save a man more than rage ever could. And with one careful, deliberate motion, Harold reached for the glove box. The officer noticed too late. "What are you—" He opened it slowly. Inside was the evidence of a truth so simple it could not be ignored. A neatly folded stack of papers, a small certificate, a folder of legal documents, proof that he was a law-abiding citizen, proof that he had recently been recognized for community service, youth mentorship, and decades of unwavering faith. A medal, a small badge of the city's appreciation for his decades of volunteering. The officer froze. For a moment, time itself seemed to stretch. The streetlights reflected off the polished plastic of the glove box, the papers, the metal. The threat in the officer's eyes faltered. Harold's voice, calm but firm, broke the silence. "Officer, I respect your duty. I always have. But I'm also a man who has lived in this community, served it, and respected its laws. That's why this," he gestured to the glove box, "is here. It proves exactly who I am." The officer swallowed, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. His hand wavered near his belt. The neighbors had stopped whispering. Everyone had paused, caught in the tension of decades of fear, authority, and respect colliding on a suburban street. "Sir," the officer finally said, voice tight, unsure, "I didn't realize." "Now you do," Harold replied quietly. His voice carried the weight of a man who had endured a lifetime of judgment, ridicule, and prejudice, but who had never stopped believing in the power of truth. The metal glinted in the streetlight, the papers folded neatly beside it, the air around them thick with the weight of silence. The moment stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. And then, slowly, the officer stepped back. "Drive carefully," he muttered. Harold nodded once, hands steady now, pulse slowly returning to normal. He closed the glove box with care, slid into the seat, and turned the key in the ignition. As the tires hummed against the asphalt, Harold glanced in the rearview mirror. The officer was still standing there, uncertain, the authority in his posture softened by undeniable proof of integrity and service. It wasn't victory. It wasn't justice. Not yet. But it was a start. And as Harold drove down the street, past neighbors peeking from porches and street lights painting halos on the asphalt, Harold understood something. Sometimes the smallest acts of truth could break through decades of fear. Sometimes the weight of a life lived right was stronger than the assumptions of a badge. The air smelled of rain and asphalt, ordinary and miraculous all at once. Harold's heart slowed. He had survived, but more than that, he had taught a lesson that couldn't be erased. The glove box was closed, the proof secured, but the story was only beginning. Because some battles weren't fought on streets, they were fought in hearts, in assumptions, in moments of courage that could change everything. And Harold Jenkins, Deacon, servant, survivor, was ready for the next step. Harold Jenkins drove the last few blocks home, each streetlight illuminating both the smooth asphalt and the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. Even with the officer finally stepping back, the grip of unease didn't leave his chest. The metal in his glove box hadn't erased the years of suspicion, the sideways glances, the whispers that followed him through grocery stores, post offices, and church events. But it had bought him something far more precious, a moment of acknowledgement that his life, his integrity, and his decades of service mattered. Yet the night was far from over. As he turned onto the familiar street lined with oaks and modest homes, Harold noticed the hush that had settled across the neighborhood. Windows, usually glowing with warm light and domestic chaos, now reflected the flashing blue of patrol cars in the distance. He slowed the car instinctively. Something wasn't right. The call from the officer earlier had rattled him, not because he feared the law, he had obeyed it his entire life, but because it reminded him how fragile that obedience felt when stacked against someone's assumptions. And now, every reflective surface, car mirrors, wet pavement, even his own darkened windshield, seemed to echo back the tension. Harold parked carefully in front of his modest home, the familiar side of his church in the distance offering a flicker of comfort. The air smelled faintly of rain and crushed leaves, a scent he associated with quiet Sunday mornings. But tonight, the air felt electric, the kind of electricity that precedes a storm, the kind that seems to whisper, Something is coming. He stepped out, keys in hand, and felt the weight of decades settle onto his shoulders, not as a burden, but as armor. Decades of serving the community, mentoring youth, counseling the lost, and guiding the faithful. All of it had prepared him for moments like this. And yet, Harold had never experienced an encounter so small in duration, yet so large in emotional consequence. Inside, his home was quiet. The television flickered with muted images of the evening news, but Harold didn't notice. His wife, Margie, had gone to visit her mother, and the silence was both comforting and unnerving. He set the car keys on the counter and let the metal from his glove box catch the dim light. The gold glinted faintly, like a small beacon in the dark. Harold sat in his chair, folding his hands over his knees. He couldn't shake the officer's words, or the way the man had leaned close, chest pressing authority onto his chest. The implied threat wasn't just about traffic violations or procedural stops. It was about assumptions, about bias, about a lifetime of people expecting less of him because of his skin. The thought tightened his chest. He remembered the sermon from Sunday morning, still resonating in his mind. Pastor Williams had said, "Every act of courage, no matter how small, pushes back against injustice. Even when the world doubts your worth, your truth shines." He let the words settle. He had acted. He had shown proof of his integrity, of his decades of service, of his commitment to his community. And yet, he knew that proof wasn't enough. Not for everyone. The phone rang, jarring in the quiet. Harold's hand hovered over it. Caller ID read, "Unknown number." Hesitation stretched between the ring and his answer. He lifted the receiver. "Hello?" A tense, clipped voice answered. "Deacon Jenkins?" "Yes." Harold straightened, sensing the weight in the voice on the other end. "This is Lieutenant Harris from the City Police Department. We need to discuss the stop tonight." Harold felt a tight knot in his stomach. The stop tonight? The officer had let him go, hadn't he? "Yes, Lieutenant," Harold replied cautiously. "There's been a concern," Harris said, voice low. "Some of our senior officers reviewed the body cam footage. There are questions about the interaction. You need to come downtown." Harold blinked. "Questions? About—" "Just come in," the lieutenant interrupted, voice firm but not hostile. "We'll review everything, make sure we understand the situation completely." Harold hung up, palms sweating. The knot in his stomach tightened. He had nothing to hide, nothing at all. And yet the weight of being scrutinized again, simply for being black, simply for living honestly, pressed down. He remembered the eyes of the passengers who had watched from their cars, from the sidewalks, from behind tinted windows. Some curious, some fearful, some judgmental. Some probably already telling themselves a story that wasn't true. The story of a church deacon stopped for suspicion, automatically cast as guilty before a word had been spoken. Harold poured himself a glass of water, hoping the simple act would steady his pulse. The cool liquid slid down his throat, grounding him. And as he sat in the quiet of his living room, he realized something. The officer might have backed down tonight, but the world would not. Bias, assumptions, and fear didn't vanish simply because one man produced proof. And if he thought this was over, he was wrong. By mid-morning, the news had begun to trickle through the local network. "Police stop raises questions in the neighborhood," one headline read. Another article noted, "Community leader pulled over by an officer. What happened?" Harold's phone began to vibrate incessantly. Calls, messages, texts, friends checking in, fellow deacons, youth group leaders, and longtime church members wanting to know if he was all right. Harold put the phone down, exhaling slowly. He knew he had done nothing wrong, and yet public perception was a powerful force, capable of twisting truth and insinuating guilt where none existed. The next knock at the door startled him. Margie's absence felt amplified any interruption. He opened it cautiously. Two men in plain clothes stood on the porch. They identified themselves immediately as internal affairs investigators, badges glinting in the morning light. "Deacon Jenkins?" one began.
"We're here to speak with you regarding last night's traffic stop." Harold nodded. "Of course," he said, leading them inside. As they sat across from him, the tension in the room thickened. He could feel it, like static in the air. These were professional men, trained to observe and assess, yet their eyes were sharp, assessing, already forming judgments. He could almost hear the echo of the officer's accusations, their words hanging in the room like a storm cloud. "Deacon," the investigator continued, "we want to understand your perspective on the stop. We have full footage, statements, everything, but we want your account." Harold leaned back, breathing slowly. He recounted every moment, lights flashing in the rearview mirror, the officer's tone, the unjust commands, the palpable threat in the way he had been addressed. And then, deliberately, he recounted the glove box, the medal, the papers, the proof of his service, of his faith, of his decades of unwavering contribution to the community. The investigators exchanged glances. One nodded slowly, pen moving on a notepad. The other remained silent, staring intently at Harold. "Deacon," the investigator said finally, "you understand that this is unusual. Most stops do not escalate to this level." Harold's voice remained calm. "I understand, but unusual is not always wrong, and wrong is not always unusual. We live in a world where assumptions can turn small moments into major threats. My job, my life, my reputation, I protect all of it with truth. That is all I've done." Silence, and the younger investigator cleared his throat. "We'll be reviewing everything thoroughly, Deacon, and we will follow up. Your account will be included in our report." Harold nodded. "Thank you." As they left, the house felt quiet again, but not safe. The tension hadn't dissipated, it had only shifted. Now he had to face the subtle but persistent threat of public perception, of assumptions that could ripple far beyond a single stop. And yet, amid the unease, Harold felt something else: resolve. The resolve to not just survive this encounter, but to transform it, to show the community, his church, and even the city that integrity, faith, and courage were stronger than fear, stronger than bias. Because sometimes survival alone is not enough. Sometimes the moment calls for action. And Harold Jenkins, deacon, mentor, servant, was ready.
The morning sun had barely risen over the city skyline when Harold Jenkins sat at his kitchen table, the metal from his glove box still glinting faintly in the early light. He hadn't slept well. Even after recounting every detail to the investigators, the memory of the officer's condescending glare and the silent judgment of the passengers lingered, pressing on his chest like a physical weight. His phone buzzed again. Another message from the church board, another concerned text from the youth group, another friend urging him to stay calm. But Harold couldn't calm. Calm would mean pretending that the incident hadn't left its mark, that the humiliation and implicit threat weren't real. Calm would be a lie. He picked up the phone reluctantly. The screen lit up with an email notification from the Internal Affairs Office. The subject line was simple: footage review, urgent findings. Heart pounding, Harold tapped the email. A link directed him to a secure portal where a folder awaited. He clicked through, expecting nothing more than the recorded traffic stop, an officer's body cam, and some procedural notes. What he found instead made him lean back in his chair, gripping the edges so tightly that his knuckles whitened. The footage began innocuously enough. Harold pulled over, as recorded by the patrol car's dash cam. The officer approached, flashlight cutting through the dim streetlight, his tone immediately sharp. "Even before I reached the window," Harold murmured to himself, eyes narrowing at the screen. "He made assumptions. Look at the way he steps, chest forward. He already decided who I was." The officer's words were clipped, forceful, bullying. But then the footage changed. A second camera angle appeared, the dash cam from a cruiser behind them, and for the first time, Harold saw the full context. The officer had been listening to a radio transmission minutes before the stop. A dispatcher had mentioned a black male in a late-model SUV, possibly involved in a petty theft. The description fit Harold in some vague, general way, the wrong skin color, the wrong car, the wrong hour. It didn't matter that he had no connection to any crime. It didn't matter that he was a deacon, a mentor, a respected member of the community. Assumptions had already made him guilty. Harold felt a pang of anger and disbelief. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop. It was a stop born of bias, systemic and invisible, and now captured in the hard, unblinking lens of a camera. He kept watching. The officer's body language shifted when Harold reached for the glove box. His hand hovered over the door handle. There was a subtle pause, almost imperceptible, but Harold felt it even now as he replayed the footage. The officer stiffened, eyes narrowing. Then, the reveal. Harold opened the glove box, and there lay the medal. A gold, polished medal from the city's Community Service Awards, along with a certificate verifying decades of work mentoring youth, volunteering at shelters, and serving the church. The officer's reaction was instantaneous. Confusion, hesitation, a barely concealed embarrassment that flickered across his face before he masked it with a stern tone. He muttered, "Carry on, sir," almost too quietly to hear. The impact of watching it on replay hit Harold differently than experiencing it in the moment. In real time, he had been too focused on survival, on the humiliation, on keeping his pulse steady. Now, watching the micro-expressions, the almost imperceptible shift in posture, he realized how close he had come to being misjudged, misrepresented, or worse, charged with something he didn't do. But there was more. Another file in the folder contained reports, internal notes flagged by a supervisor reviewing the stop afterward. Lines like, "Discrepancy in standard protocol, officer escalated unnecessary tension, officer admitted assumptions influenced actions, review for implicit bias training recommended." Reading that, Harold felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow. Vindication that he had been right to trust himself, to remain calm, to show the medal when called upon. Sorrow for all those who didn't have that proof, who bore the brunt of assumptions daily, without recourse, without recognition. The folder also contained email exchanges between officers. One message read, "Stop on Jenkins was uncomfortable, felt wrong from the start, justified eventually with medal in glove box, but tension high. Need awareness on bias toward community leaders of color." Another simply said, "Could have gone badly. Need review." Harold leaned back, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just a personal victory. This was documentation, proof that what he had felt, the subtle threat, the assumption of guilt, was real, systemic, and dangerous. He paused, thinking about the other faces that had stared from their cars as he was pulled over, the judgment, the curiosity, the silent evaluation. How many of them would have believed him if the medal hadn't been there? How many would have assumed the worst? His thoughts turned to the church, to the youth he had mentored, to the families he had guided through crises. If this could happen to him, a man known and respected in the community, what message did it send to those who didn't have proof of their integrity? Harold opened the next file. It was a news alert, captured automatically by the police department system, showing social media posts from people who had witnessed the stop. Comments varied from mild curiosity to outright speculation, some framing the incident as a suspicious encounter, others defending him. Harold read each one with a mixture of frustration and resolve. Social perception was a battlefield, and today he had survived it with grace, but the war for truth was just beginning. He set the laptop aside, rubbing his temples. There was a quiet knock at the door. Margie's voice called from the other side. "Harold, you okay in there?" He took a deep breath. "I'm fine," he said, voice steady, though the tension in his chest lingered. "Just processing some things." When he opened the door, Margie handed him a cup of coffee, her eyes soft but searching. "I saw some posts online," she said gently, "people talking about what happened. You're handling it okay?" Harold took the coffee, feeling its warmth seep into his hands. "I'm not just handling it, I'm understanding it, and I'm going to do something about it." Margie looked at him, the mix of worry and pride clear on her face. "You always do, Harold, you always do." He nodded, thinking about the next steps, filing complaints, preparing statements, reaching out to community allies.
but also reaching out to those in law enforcement who had the courage to confront bias, to ensure that no one else would face what he had. The revelation wasn't just about the officer's assumptions, it was about systemic issues, subtle, insidious, and powerful. And Harold knew that if change was going to happen, he had to be part of it. That evening, the church hall was quiet. Harold set the medal on the podium before the congregation arrived, reflecting on the irony. It was a simple object, yet it carried the weight of decades, protecting him in a moment when assumptions threatened to overwhelm. The parishioners filed in, chatting softly, unaware of the night's ordeal, unaware of the storm Harold had navigated. He cleared his throat, speaking to the empty hall, almost as a promise to himself. Proof can protect us, yes, but courage, patience, and truth, they protect more, and we will need all three in the days ahead. Outside, the city hummed with life, unaware of the revelation Harold had uncovered within its streets. But inside his heart, a fire had been lit, a determination not only to defend his own name, but to illuminate a truth that could change perceptions, policies, and lives. Because sometimes, the hardest battles weren't fought with fists or weapons, they were fought with dignity, evidence, and the courage to insist that reality reflected truth, not prejudice. Harold Jenkins was ready, and the revelation had only just begun to unfold.
The next morning, Harold Jenkins arrived at the police department with a mixture of resolve and unease knotting his stomach. The building loomed large, its glass and concrete exterior reflecting the weak sunlight. Even from a distance, he could feel the weight of authority pressing down, as if the walls themselves had absorbed decades of judgment, prejudice, and procedural coldness. Inside, the reception area buzzed with quiet activity. Phones rang, officers moved briskly, and the scent of coffee mingled with the faint tang of disinfectant. Harold checked in with the front desk and was escorted to a small conference room, one that smelled faintly of old carpet and nervous energy. He wasn't alone for long. Within minutes, Captain Lawrence Miller entered, clipboard in hand, followed by Sergeant Daniels, the very officer who had pulled him over the night before. Daniels' expression was carefully neutral, though Harold caught the flicker of something else. Surprise, maybe even apprehension. "Mr. Jenkins," Captain Miller began, his voice calm but authoritative, "we are here to review the incident from last night. Our goal is clarity, accountability, and, where necessary, corrective action." Harold nodded, his own voice steady. "I understand, Captain. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify what happened." Captain Miller gestured toward Daniels. "Sergeant Daniels will provide his account, and then we'll go through the footage line by line." Daniels cleared his throat. I followed standard procedure, sir. I had reason to believe the vehicle matched a description for a reported theft. I pulled the car over to investigate." Harold held the officer's gaze. There was no malice in his eyes, only the quiet precision of a man who had lived by rules, yet had failed to see how bias could infiltrate those rules. "Sergeant, you were wrong," Harold said calmly. "The assumption of guilt based on skin color, a vehicle, and a vague report, that is not standard. That is prejudice masquerading as protocol." Daniels blinked. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Sir, I didn't mean it." "You didn't have to mean it," Harold interrupted gently but firmly. "Intent isn't the point. Impact is. And the impact was clear. A black man, a deacon in his community, was treated as a criminal without cause. That is unacceptable." The room was silent for a moment. Even Captain Miller's usually impassive face tightened. He motioned for Harold to continue. "I have the footage," Harold said, reaching into his briefcase and producing a USB drive. "It captures everything. My interactions, your approach, and the moment you saw the medal in my glove box. You can watch it yourself." Captain Miller took the drive with a nod and inserted it into the laptop on the table. The screen flickered to life, showing the dash cam footage from multiple angles. For a moment, Daniels shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with the screen. There he was, pulling Harold over, tone sharp, posture rigid. There was the immediate tension, the unspoken accusation, the subtle yet unmistakable sign of prejudice in the officer's approach. Then the pivotal moment, the glove box opening, revealing the gold medal and certificate of service.
Daniel's expression faltered, confusion and embarrassment flashing across his face before he masked it with a stern nod. Harold paused the video on that frame, letting the silence stretch. "Do you see this, Sergeant? This is a man's life, reputation, and dignity reduced to assumptions in an instant. This is why training, awareness, and accountability exist, because even good officers, without conscious ill intent, can cause irreparable harm." Daniel swallowed hard, eyes darting from the paused screen to Harold and back again. "Sir, I didn't mean to." "You didn't have to mean it," Harold said firmly. "Intent isn't the point, impact is, and the impact was clear. A black man, a deacon in his community, was treated as a criminal without cause. That is unacceptable." Captain Miller nodded slowly. "We've reviewed the footage multiple times. We agree that the stop was escalated unnecessarily and that the assumption of guilt was unjustified. Sergeant Daniels, you will undergo retraining on implicit bias, community engagement, and situational awareness. Additionally, you will issue a formal apology to Mr. Jenkins." Daniel's jaw tightened. Harold could see the conflict in his eyes, pride versus responsibility, instinct versus truth. "Yes, sir," Daniels finally said, voice tight. "I'll comply." Harold leaned back, exhaling slowly. The confrontation wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability and clarity. It was about making sure that the next person, the next community leader, the next black man or woman wouldn't face the same humiliation without recourse. Captain Miller cleared his throat. "Mr. Jenkins, we also want to use this incident as a case study for the department, not to single anyone out, but to highlight the importance of protocol, bias recognition, and de-escalation." Harold nodded, admitting the silence settled between them. "If it educates even one officer, prevents one unjust stop, it will be worth it. But it can't stop there. There needs to be ongoing training, monitoring, and community dialogue. Words without action are meaningless." Daniels exhaled, shoulders heavy with realization. "I understand that now," he admitted quietly. "I never realized how my assumptions could escalate the situation. I see it now, clearly." Harold nodded, allowing the words to settle between them. "Acknowledgement is the first step, then action must follow." Captain Miller gestured toward the door. "We'll finalize the report today. Mr. Jenkins, your statement will be included. Sergeant Daniels will write his account and acknowledge his errors. Once that's complete, this matter will be closed internally. Publicly, we can craft a statement emphasizing the importance of accountability and training without compromising anyone's privacy." Harold stood, extending his hand to Daniels. The officer hesitated, then shook it, a firm but awkward grasp. "Thank you for your patience," Daniel said quietly. "Patience is part of faith, Sergeant, and sometimes it's part of justice, too." As he left the department, Harold felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief. The confrontation had been tense, unflinching, and deeply personal, but it had also been necessary. Truth, Harold realized, was never just a personal matter, it was a communal responsibility, something that extended beyond a single traffic stop or a single officer. Outside, the morning had fully broken. Cars honked in the streets, people hurried to work, and the city carried on as if unaware of the small but profound victory that had taken place inside the conference room. Harold paused, looking up at the sky. There was a weight lifted, yes, but also a responsibility that remained. He would continue his work at the church, mentoring the youth, guiding the families, and reminding them that dignity and courage mattered more than fear or assumption. And he would continue to hold those in power accountable, not out of malice, but out of a profound belief in justice. Because sometimes, Harold thought, the confrontation isn't the end, it's just the beginning. And for those who dare to face it, it becomes the catalyst for change, for awareness, and, eventually, for healing. By the time Harold returned to his car, the streets were alive with the rhythm of the city, and though the morning was ordinary, he knew it would resonate for weeks, months, maybe even years, proof that one man, armed with courage, dignity, and evidence, could stand up to bias, confront it head-on, and demand the truth be acknowledged. And that, Harold realized, was more powerful than any medal.
By the afternoon, the ripple effects of the traffic stop had begun to spread far beyond the polished floors of the police department. News travels fast in the digital age, but this story moved faster than most. Within hours, the local news outlets were buzzing. Headlines screamed across social media feeds, framing the incident in stark, unavoidable terms. Church deacon pulled over, glove box reveals shocking truth, and bias on the road? Traffic stop sparks debate. Harold Jenkins sat quietly in his study at the church, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows and casting vibrant patterns across the hardwood floor. He had returned after the confrontation, hoping for a moment of peace, yet the world outside seemed anything but calm. His phone buzzed constantly, notifications piled up, emails from community leaders, pastors, concerned parents, and local activists, calls from television producers requesting interviews, invitations to town hall discussions, and even messages from strangers who had somehow learned the story within minutes. For Harold, the attention was overwhelming. He had never sought the spotlight. His life had been rooted in service, preaching on Sundays, mentoring youth, counseling families, and organizing community events. He had never imagined that a routine drive, followed by a wrongful stop, would place him at the center of a storm. Yet as he scrolled through the headlines, he realized something profound. The incident had touched a nerve. People were hungry for accountability, for transparency, for someone willing to speak the truth, and Harold had provided it, not with anger or revenge, but with calm, evidence-based courage. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels found himself navigating a very different kind of fallout. At the precinct, whispers circulated like wildfire. Some colleagues sympathized, acknowledging the lessons he had learned. Others were harsher, hinting at embarrassment, damaged reputations, and the scrutiny that now followed him. Daniel's desk phone rang endlessly from both his superiors and local journalists, each inquiry a reminder that one moment of poor judgment could ripple outward into consequences he had never anticipated. Captain Miller, understanding the delicate balance, had instructed Daniels to focus on retraining and public accountability. This is not punishment, but it is a reminder that your actions have weight beyond what you may perceive. Every citizen, every family, every individual you encounter deserves respect. Mistakes on the street can have consequences far beyond the ticket you write. Daniels took the instructions seriously, but the reality was harsher. Emails flooded in from advocacy groups demanding explanations, apologies, and reform. Online, social media users dissected the footage, shared their interpretations, and debated the broader implications of profiling and systemic bias. Some criticized the police department as a whole, while others singled out Daniels personally, questioning whether he could ever be trusted to perform his duties fairly again. Back at the church, Harold's own life began to shift in unexpected ways. The congregation, initially unaware of the stop, had learned of the story through a friend's forwarded article. That evening, Harold found himself standing before the congregation during a midweek service, the room filled with expectant eyes. "I know some of you have heard about what happened," Harold began, his voice steady but measured. A stop, a misunderstanding, and a moment that could have escalated into something far worse. "I want you to know that while the world outside may judge quickly, we have the power to respond with dignity, with clarity, and with truth." Whispers of agreement rippled through the pews. Mothers and fathers, young adults and elders alike absorbed his words, many nodding silently. They had seen injustice before, in countless subtle and overt ways, and Harold's courage provided a mirror reflecting both hope and responsibility. But not everyone's reaction was supportive. Vanessa Whittemore, a local figure known for her outspoken views on civility and order, posted a scathing opinion piece online. "Every officer faces pressures most of us will never understand, yet some citizens exploit these situations to push personal narratives, turning routine law enforcement into moral theater." Her post garnered thousands of shares and comments, igniting a heated debate between supporters of Harold's stance and those defending the officers. Harold didn't respond immediately. He understood that the conversation wasn't about confrontation, but about influence. Every public reaction, every article,
every comment represented a potential opportunity to educate, to reshape perspectives, and to prevent similar incidents in the future. By evening, several local radio stations had requested interviews, asking Harold to discuss the stop, but also the broader implications of bias, assumption, in community policing. Each interview required careful thought. Harold knew that his words could guide, challenge, or inspire listeners, particularly those who had experienced similar injustices or those who held positions of influence. "Bias doesn't always wear a uniform," Harold said during one radio segment. "It can hide in assumptions, in silence, in a failure to see the humanity in another person. Recognizing it, acknowledging it, and acting against it, that's how we create change." The fallout wasn't confined to media coverage. Within the church, community leaders approached Harold with new proposals, programs for youth emphasizing civic awareness, workshops on racial profiling and respect, and mentorship initiatives connecting law enforcement with local neighborhoods. The incident had opened doors Harold had never anticipated.
Simultaneously, Daniel struggled privately. Each night, after the precinct emptied and the lights dimmed, he replayed the stop in his mind. The moment Harold had opened the glove box, the gold medal glinting in the dim streetlight, the realization of what he had almost missed haunted him. He began volunteering for additional community engagement programs, participating in implicit bias workshops, and even offering to collaborate with local leaders to improve communication and trust between officers and the communities they served. Yet not all the backlash was public or professional. Some members of Daniel's family expressed frustration, worried about his reputation. Social media trolls targeted both him and Harold, each side accusing the other of misrepresentation, and each post increasing the tension in an already charged situation. Daniels had to navigate these challenges carefully, balancing accountability with his own well-being, while Harold sought to use the heightened visibility to foster dialogue, not division. As the week progressed, the local government took notice. City council meetings opened with discussions about the incident, with Harold invited to provide testimony. The emphasis was not on blame, but on lessons learned, policy improvements, and the critical need for transparency in law enforcement practices. Harold spoke with a calm authority, explaining the nuances of human behavior, systemic bias, and the ripple effects of even a brief encounter on the street. "Every citizen deserves to be seen," Harold told the council. "Not as a suspect, not as a number, but as a human being with a life, a history, and dignity. When we fail to see that, we fail each other." The council members nodded, some taking notes diligently, others glancing at their aides with the quiet understanding that change slow, steady, and necessary was in motion. By the end of the week, the fallout had settled into a new reality. The incident remained a topic of discussion in the media, within law enforcement, and across community organizations. Harold had become a symbol of calm authority and moral clarity, while Daniels had embarked on a difficult, reflective journey to reconcile his actions with his responsibility to serve and protect impartially and in the quiet moments. When Harold returned to his office, closed the doors, and looked at the photograph of his late father and mother, he realized something profound. The fallout, though challenging and exhausting, was not punishment, it was opportunity. Opportunity to educate, to heal, to prevent future injustices. The city outside continued its rhythm, oblivious to the small but significant changes unfolding within it. But Harold knew the impact would echo far beyond the headlines, far beyond the immediate controversy. Change, he understood, began with courage, evidence, and the unwavering willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And this, he realized, was just the beginning of a larger movement, one that could alter the landscape of community, law enforcement, and justice for years to come.
The morning after the story went viral, the city seemed to pulse with tension. Headlines still screamed across social media and news websites. Deacon's glove box reveals truth. Officer faces questions. Church leader or symbol, community in debate. Traffic stop sparks national conversation on policing. Notifications on phones rang like alarm bells, Inboxes flooded with messages, and the coffee shops buzzed with whispered arguments. Harold Jenkins stepped outside the church after morning prayers, the air sharp with early autumn chill. The streets were busy with commuters, children heading to school, and vendors setting up stands along the sidewalks. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of the city, an undercurrent of scrutiny and judgment carried over from the digital world. Eyes lingered a little too long, conversations paused when he walked by. Some people nodded in support, others in suspicion. Harold felt the weight, but he refused to show it. By noon, the backlash had taken shape in more tangible ways. Flyers and posters appeared overnight around downtown, accusing Harold of exaggerating events, turning a routine traffic stop into a spectacle, and leveraging the story for personal gain. Social media accounts posted snippets of the incident, often taken out of context, twisting Harold's calm demeanor into arrogance or defiance. Trolls questioned his motives. Why would a church deacon keep valuables in his glove box? What's he hiding? Even within his own community, tensions began to rise. Some congregation members voiced concern. "Are we doing the right thing by supporting him so openly?" one whispered during a committee meeting. "Could this bring trouble to the church?" Another added, "I worry about our children. What example are we setting?" The questions were reasonable, born of genuine worry, yet they added a layer of stress Harold had not anticipated. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels was navigating a backlash of an entirely different kind. Internal Affairs had opened a formal review of the stop, calling in statements from multiple witnesses, reviewing footage from the traffic camera, and interviewing Daniels himself. Emails from the chief circled repeatedly on his screen, a mix of concern, warning, and procedural directives. "Your actions will be scrutinized," one message read. "Ensure all statements are factual and unbiased." Daniels knew the weight of that review. One mistake, one misworded response could follow him for the rest of his career. Public opinion, however, was less patient. Online forums filled with debate. Comments ranged from outrage to praise, from fear to defense. Some defended Daniels, claiming he was performing his duty, while others defended Harold, highlighting the importance of courage in the face of potential discrimination. Articles on national news sites drew in readers from other states, broadening the conversation beyond the city. Even politicians began weighing in. A city council member held a press conference, calling for a review of local traffic enforcement policies. "This incident," the official said, "has highlighted concerns about officer discretion, profiling, and community trust. We must act to ensure accountability, transparency, and respect in every encounter between law enforcement and citizens." The council members' words were careful, measured, but their impact was immediate. Headlines screamed their quotes across both local and regional outlets. Harold's phone never stopped vibrating. Calls from journalists wanting interviews, invitations to panels, emails from advocacy organizations, and private messages of support and concern poured in simultaneously. Some were kind, some were hostile. Every single one demanded attention. Every single one required thought. He felt the pressure, but he leaned on experience, on faith, and on the memory of his late parents, who had always taught him that leadership meant standing firm even when the storm raged. At home, Harold reviewed each message carefully. One email stood out, a legal notice from an attorney representing Daniels, requesting that Harold provide a detailed statement of the incident and offering to resolve matters quietly. Harold frowned, reading the words again. He sensed that this was not just an attempt to gather facts, it was an attempt to intimidate, to pressure him into silence. He placed the email aside, his resolve strengthening. "Truth can't be silenced," he whispered to himself. Meanwhile, Daniels faced similar tensions. He had returned home after long hours at the precinct, only to find social media messages questioning his integrity, professionalism, and even personal character. Every notification seemed like a small sting. He sat in his living room, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of scrutiny pressing down on him from every direction.
And yet, beneath the anxiety, there was a flicker of clarity. He had seen the glove box, he had seen the gold medal, and he knew the truth. He hadn't been malicious, he had been human, and now being human meant facing the consequences of a split-second decision. The backlash extended into unexpected places. Local businesses that had previously supported Harold's church reached out cautiously, questioning whether they should continue sponsorships or donations. Parent-teacher associations sought assurances about school programs, wondering if association with Harold might be controversial. Even community events Harold had organized came under scrutiny, with questions raised about his motives and affiliations. Harold met with his closest advisors and church board members. They gathered in the old fellowship hall, sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows, illuminating the worried faces of those he trusted most. "We can't ignore this," Harold said firmly. "People are afraid, some are confused, some are angry, but we have to act with clarity, honesty, and patience. Retreating or hiding will not help anyone." One board member hesitated. "But Harold, the backlash is growing. Even some of our members of the congregation are questioning us. How do we handle the public pressure?" Harold looked out the window at the city below. Cars moved in slow lines, the hum of life continuing, oblivious to the storm brewing in every smartphone, news outlet, and whispered conversation. "We handle it the same way we've handled everything," he said slowly, "with truth, compassion, and action. Let the facts speak. Let our community see that courage is stronger than fear." The following days became a delicate balancing act. Harold continued his ministry, engaged with the public, and gave measured interviews to the press. Each statement emphasized calm, transparency, and faith, carefully steering the narrative toward justice rather than controversy. Daniels, meanwhile, attended mandatory bias training, participated in community outreach programs, and offered testimony in public forums, showing his commitment to accountability. Yet the backlash lingered. Trolls and critics continued to post online, some going so far as to dig into Harold's past, searching for anything to discredit him. Anonymous social media accounts spread rumors, some grounded in truth, others fabricated entirely. The tension grew palpable in the city, reaching into neighborhoods, workplaces, and schools. Even within law enforcement, debates raged. Officers discussed the incident in hushed tones at the precinct, some sympathizing with Daniels, others acknowledging the undeniable courage Harold had shown. Policy discussions began about officer discretion, implicit bias, and the importance of documentation during routine stops.
Trainings that were once optional became mandatory. The department realized that one moment, one stop, one revelation could catalyze widespread change if handled correctly. Back in the church, Harold took a quiet moment to pray. Kneeling in the old wooden pews, he sought guidance and clarity. "Lord," he whispered, "give me strength, give me wisdom. Let me navigate this storm not for myself, but for those who need to see that integrity matters." The words, though soft, carried weight. He understood that the backlash, while frightening and exhausting, was also an opportunity, a chance to guide, educate, and transform. As evening fell over the city, the situation remained tense. Local news stations aired updates on the incident, social media continued to buzz, and community conversations spilled into homes, workplaces, and schools. Harold's phone rang continuously, each call a reminder that the story was far from over. But he remained calm, resolved to let the truth guide his actions. The backlash, though powerful, had unintended consequences. Conversations about racial profiling, accountability, and community trust had reached corners of the city that rarely engaged with such topics. Community leaders held meetings, local governments scheduled forums, and neighborhood associations organized panels, all inspired by one simple, unassuming act: a glove box, a medal, and the courage to reveal the truth. By the end of the week, Harold had established a small task force within the church to address community concerns, provide education, and foster dialogue between law enforcement and citizens.
Daniels had begun collaborating with community leaders, participating in listening sessions, and working to rebuild trust. The backlash, though exhausting and often hostile, had sparked necessary conversations and initiated the slow work of change. Harold knew the path ahead would not be easy. Critics would continue, tensions would persist, and the city's gaze would remain fixed on every move he made. But he also knew that courage had a ripple effect. Each action, each conversation, each moment of integrity contributed to a larger movement, and in the face of backlash, that movement could not be silenced. Even as the city slept that night, Harold remained at the church reviewing letters, emails, and notes from concerned citizens. He read the words of gratitude, hope, and solidarity that balanced the criticism, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The backlash had arrived, loud, insistent, and unavoidable, but it would not define him. Instead, it would refine him, sharpen his resolve, and provide the foundation for the next steps in a journey that had only just begun.
The city had not yet fully breathed since the incident. Headlines still blared across screens, from local morning news to national websites. Deacon's glove box reveals truth. Officer under fire. Traffic stop sparks nationwide debate on law enforcement. The story had transcended the borders of their small city, sparking conversations in offices, living rooms, and churches across the country. Harold Jenkins felt the weight of it all as he walked through the streets near his church. Every step carried whispers, some in admiration, others in doubt. He'd grown accustomed to scrutiny over the years, but this felt different. This was personal, systemic, and undeniably public. People weren't just watching him, they were watching the system itself. Inside the church, a meeting convened. Harold, the church board, legal counsel, and a few trusted community leaders gathered around the long oak table in the fellowship hall. Papers, emails, and news clippings were spread out like battlefield maps. Every word mattered. Every decision would echo far beyond these walls. "We need clarity," Harold said, voice calm but firm. "Not just for me, not just for the officer, but for the city. People need to know what really happened and why it matters." One of the board members, Mrs. Thompson, nodded. "But Harold, the backlash is relentless. The media wants spectacle. Social media wants outrage. How do we steer this in a constructive direction?" Harold leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "We let the facts lead, not the fear. We'll collaborate with law enforcement, with legal advisors, with journalists who care about truth, but we do it on our terms, on the side of integrity, not sensationalism." Meanwhile, Officer Daniels had returned to the precinct to feeling the full force of administrative scrutiny. Internal Affairs had requested a detailed statement, citing possible procedural oversights, though the underlying tension was clear. The public and the department were both watching. Daniels knew the story could define his career or end it. He had already spent countless hours reviewing body cam footage, dash cam recordings, and reports. Every word mattered. Every detail could be interpreted in multiple ways. Across the city, community organizations were mobilizing. Advocacy groups contacted Harold, offering supports and legal guidance. They emphasized the need for policy reviews, transparency in traffic stops, and training sessions on bias and community relations. Harold listened carefully, jotting notes, planning meetings, and considering every angle. The backlash had become a catalyst. It had forced action. The first step, Harold decided, was a public forum. Flyers went up across neighborhoods, community dialogue on policing, accountability, and trust, hosted by Jenkins Fellowship. Invitations were sent to city officials, law enforcement leaders, journalists, and civic organizations. Harold knew this wasn't more than a discussion. It was a chance to frame the narrative, to ensure that truth prevailed over rumor. On the morning of the forum, the church hall was packed. Chairs filled the space, and overflow crowds stood along the walls. Journalists set up cameras, microphones were adjusted, and city council representatives took notes.
Harold stood at the podium, the stained glass casting fractured patterns across the room, symbolic in a way he could not ignore. "Thank you all for coming," Harold began, voice steady. "This forum is about accountability, transparency, and dialogue. The incident that has captured national attention is not just about one traffic stop. It is about the relationship between our community and law enforcement. It is about trust, fairness, and responsibility." Officer Daniels was seated near the front, quietly observing. He had agreed to participate, knowing that his credibility, career, and conscience were all on the line. When Harold gestured toward him, he nodded, rising to speak. "I want to start by acknowledging the incident," Daniels said carefully. "I understand the concerns raised, and I take my responsibility seriously. Our goal is always safety, yours and ours, but I also recognize the impact of our actions, both seen and unseen." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Questions came quickly from reporters, community leaders, and concerned citizens. Why was the stop initiated? Was there bias involved? What protocols exist to prevent similar incidents? Each question was pointed, deliberate, and sometimes accusatory. Daniels answered with calm professionalism, while Harold supplemented context about the larger societal and historical implications. Behind the cameras, media analysts whispered, comparing statements and watching body language. This forum, meant to clarify, also carried the potential to ignite new waves of controversy. Every nuance mattered. Every gesture was scrutinized. As discussions deepened, a critical detail emerged. The glove box, the focal point of the incident, had contained items that carried symbolic and practical weight. A gold medallion awarded for decades of community service, family photographs, letters of commendation, and documents outlining Harold's charitable initiatives. It was not just an ordinary collection of possessions, it represented years of dedication, sacrifice, and trust. The revelation shifted the room. What had initially seemed like potential misconduct by Harold was now seen in a new light. The Deacon's secrets were merely tangible evidence of a life devoted to service, community, and integrity. Some journalists scribbled notes rapidly, realizing the narrative was more nuanced than initial reports suggested. Back at the precinct, Daniels reviewed footage of the stop once more, this time with legal counsel present. The images showed Harold's calm demeanor, his careful responses, and the respectful but firm way he had interacted with the officer. It became clear that the initial assumption of tension or defiance had been magnified by misunderstanding and preconception. The counsel advised documenting every detail, gathering witness statements, and preparing for further media inquiries. Accuracy now was the weapon against misinformation. Across social media, citizens began to pivot. Local influencers who had initially posted sensational takes began highlighting Harold's service record, posting images of community events, and sharing personal stories of the Deacon's generosity. Hashtags shifted from traffic stop controversy to Deacon Jenkins integrity. Conversations, once sharply divisive, now explored broader issues: fairness, racial bias, and the importance of context in media reporting. As the forum concluded, Harold and Daniels stepped aside to debrief. There was a mutual understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that their actions, choices, and transparency had prevented the incident from spiraling further. Daniels, usually reserved, said, "I didn't realize the impact this would have, not just on me, but on the community. Seeing the response today, it's changed my perspective." Harold nodded. "It's never just about one person. Accountability is about the system, the relationships, in the community we serve. That's why we must keep working, keep engaging, and keep listening." The days that followed saw further steps towards formal accountability. The city announced an independent review panel composed of community leaders, law enforcement representatives, and neutral observers. Their mandate was clear: analyze policies, identify potential weaknesses, and recommend reforms to ensure fair and transparent enforcement practices. Harold inputted insight, emphasizing education, community trust, and proactive engagement. Meanwhile, Daniels participated in additional training and outreach programs, volunteering time at youth centers, participating in mentorship initiatives, and actively engaging in discussions on police-community relations. The officer who had once felt cornered by scrutiny now became part of a solution, demonstrating that accountability and growth were not mutually exclusive. In the broader community, the incident sparked civic dialogue. Local schools hosted panels on social justice and responsibility, neighborhood associations organized listening sessions, churches and community organizations began collaborating with law enforcement to develop mutual understanding and training programs. What began as a singular traffic stop evolved into a catalyst for dialogue, education, and transformation. Harold, however, remained focused on the individual lives affected. He continued his pastoral duties, met privately with citizens who felt marginalized or unheard, and ensured that the lessons from the incident were applied in tangible ways. The glove box, once a source of suspicion, now symbolized the potential for understanding, communication, and reconciliation. As night fell, he sat at his desk one evening, reviewing letters of support from citizens, educators, and fellow clergy members. He realized that the hunt for accountability had not ended, it had transformed. What was once a backlash-fueled frenzy was now a measured, deliberate effort to strengthen trust, improve policies, and ensure that justice and integrity prevailed. And as night fell, he reflected quietly. The hunt for accountability was not about punishment, it was about clarity, transparency, and learning. It was about creating a system where courage, honesty, and moral action were recognized and amplified. And though the challenges ahead remained, Harold felt a quiet satisfaction. For the first time in days, he believed that true accountability was possible, and that one act of courage, one calm decision, one steadfast commitment to truth could ripple outward to reshape an entire community.
Weeks had passed since the traffic stop that had ignited national attention. The glare of headlines, the flurry of social media debates, and the tension in the streets had begun to settle into something more measured, reflective. For many, it had been a sensational story, a flashpoint of controversy. But for Harold Jenkins, Officer Daniels, and the community at large, it was the beginning of a transformation that would reverberate far beyond the courthouse or city hall. Harold sat in the quiet sanctuary of his church office, sunlight filtering through the stained glass, casting muted colors across his desk. The stillness was a sharp contrast to the chaos of those initial days. The letters on his desk were from all corners of the city. Citizens who had once been silent, now sharing their voices. They thanked him not just for his courage during the incident, but for catalyzing a broader conversation on trust, accountability, and community engagement. He opened one of the letters carefully. It was from a young man in his early 20s, a recent college graduate. The note was simple, but the sentiment was profound. Because of your example, I finally felt seen. I realized that speaking truth, even when others doubt you, matters. You've reminded me that integrity isn't just a word, it's action. Harold allowed himself a small, weary smile. This was why he had endured the scrutiny, the whispers, and the relentless questioning. It wasn't about vindication, it was about the lives touched, the ripples of understanding that spread farther than any single headline could measure. Officer Daniels, too, felt the weight of those days. The internal review had concluded, not with reprimands or blame, but with recommendations for departmental improvements. Transparency protocols were revised, de-escalation training was expanded, and a citywide initiative to foster dialogue between officers and community leaders was launched. Daniels had volunteered to lead several of these workshops, eager to bridge gaps and rebuild trust. The officer who had once felt cornered under scrutiny now embraced the opportunity to serve in a new capacity. The glove box, once a symbol of suspicion and tension, had become a touchstone of reflection. Its contents, the medallions, photographs, letters, remained emblematic of a life devoted to service. A small plaque was mounted in the church foyer. Courage and integrity reside in the smallest acts. It served as a reminder that even the simplest of items could carry profound significance, and that assumptions, however quick, were rarely the whole story. Across town, community forums continued, evolving into permanent programs. Youth groups, neighborhood associations, and civic organizations partnered with law enforcement to host monthly dialogue sessions. Officers and residents spoke openly about bias, accountability, and safety. Harold often moderated, his calm voice guiding conversations that could have easily spiraled into confrontation. The energy in the room had shifted. Curiosity replaced fear. Engagement replaced anger. People no longer merely consumed the news, they participated in the solution. The city council passed legislation encouraging transparency in police stops, mandating clearer communication with citizens, and requiring that community members be invited to review and contribute to departmental policies. Daniel's precinct became a model for similar initiatives in neighboring cities. He often thought back to that day, to the moment he opened the glove box, and marveled at how a single act, one that could have escalated into tragedy, had instead ignited systemic change. Harold, meanwhile, had begun writing his reflections, not for fame or fortune, but to leave a record for future generations. His notes detailed the incident, the immediate aftermath, the fear and uncertainty, and the steps taken toward accountability. He wrote about the courage it took to stay calm under scrutiny, the importance of integrity, and the power of community collaboration. He wanted people to understand that transformation was possible, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Social media, once the battlefield of outrage, now carried stories of hope and progress. Citizens shared experiences of dialogue sessions, officers highlighted community successes, and local media ran features on the lasting impact of the event. Hashtags like accountability matters and trust in action trended in the city, reflecting a collective commitment to learning and improvement. The narrative had shifted from conflict to collaboration, from scandal to reflection. One evening, Harold walked through the church garden, the late spring air heavy with the scent of magnolia blossoms. The setting sun painted the sky in deep shades of orange and purple, a quiet, solemn beauty that mirrored his thoughts. He paused, listening to the distant sounds of laughter and conversation from the fellowship hall, where a youth mentorship program was underway. These were the faces of a future shaped by understanding, a generation learning that courage, honesty, and compassion could coexist with authority, responsibility, and law. Daniels arrived, the two men exchanging a nod that spoke volumes. No words were necessary. They had both endured scrutiny, navigated uncertainty, and emerged committed to a shared goal, ensuring that accountability was not just reactive, but proactive. Together, they walked through the garden, reflecting on the unlikely path from confrontation to resolution. "Harold," Daniel said finally, his voice quiet in the evening air, "I used to think accountability was about avoiding blame. Now I see it's about understanding. It's about doing the right thing even when no one is watching." Harold nodded, a faint smile playing across his lips. "Exactly. And it's about teaching others to do the same. We can't control every narrative, but we can control how we respond and what we leave behind." That night, the church held a special service, inviting the community to celebrate resilience, integrity, and reconciliation. Harold spoke from the pulpit, his words deliberate, heartfelt. "We've seen how one moment can spark fear, how assumptions can divide us, but we've also seen how truth, courage, and dialogue can heal. Accountability isn't a punishment, it's a commitment. It's a promise to ourselves, our neighbors, and future generations that we will do better." Daniel sat among the congregation, listening, absorbing. He felt the weight of the community's trust and the responsibility it carried. In the days and months ahead, he would continue to work tirelessly to uphold it. Outside the church, reporters gathered to capture the event. Questions came quickly, but Harold answered with clarity, patience, and composure. The incident was a reminder, he said, that integrity matters more than appearances, that understanding matters more than assumptions, and that every person, regardless of circumstance, deserves to be treated with respect. As cameras clicked and microphones recorded, the story that had begun with tension, fear, and national attention was now one of reflection, growth, and enduring impact.
It was no longer just about a traffic stop or a glove box. It was about the community, accountability, and the power of truth. In the weeks that followed, Harold and Daniels continued to collaborate on initiatives, from youth mentorship programs to policy reviews, community forums, and public speaking engagements. The legacy of the incident had grown beyond the immediate parties involved, touching lives across the city and inspiring change in neighboring communities. Finally, in the quiet of his office, Harold placed the contents of the infamous glove box on a shelf, carefully arranged, symbolic, and unassailable. A photograph of the church's youth group, the medallion recognizing decades of service, letters from grateful citizens, and the notes Daniels had prepared about the stop, all of it remained a testament to what could be accomplished when courage met integrity. He stepped back, looking at the collection, a deep sense of satisfaction washing over him. The city had seen its fear, its bias, and its flaws, and through honesty, reflection, and deliberate action, it had begun to find its redemption. Accountability, Harold realized, was not an event. It was a journey, a continuous pursuit of understanding, fairness, and courage. And in that pursuit, the community had not only discovered the truth about one traffic stop, but also the enduring power of integrity, trust, and hope. Outside, the city skyline gleamed under the morning sun. The streets were alive with movement, conversation, and possibility. Harold, Daniels, and countless others had ignited a spark, one that promised vigilance, transparency, and above all, justice for generations to come. And in that quiet, resilient glow, the legacy of that day, the Deacon, the officer, and the glove box, would never be forgotten.